Welcome to A-Push. Today we're going to try to tackle the monstrosity that is Washington's presidency, which is a huge topic for one class, so we'll see if we can get through it all, but we're going to give it our best shot. Here are your basic objectives. So take a moment, pause, and absorb. And let's try to tell the story of the indispensable man himself. So, Washington was elected unanimously, and honestly, the presidency was designed with him in mind. It's unlikely that they could have gotten anti-federalists to agree to the Constitution and the whole office of the presidency if it wasn't completely understood by everyone involved that George Washington was going to be the first president. These other votes are somewhat confusing, but just remember, in the original system, each elector got 2 votes, and the person who got the most votes became president, and the person who got the second most votes became vice president. And if that sounds like it's going to cause problems in the future, way to think ahead. But for now, everything is great. George Washington is unanimously raised to the presidency, and we get the beginning of the whole American constitutional experiment. Washington's presidency is noteworthy because as the first president, he's going to set a whole series of presidential precedents. These are customs almost as strong as law that are going to define the presidency for the indeterminate future. For example, Washington was a general, but he always dressed in civilian clothing, something that every single other president has adhered to. So even our presidents, and we've had many of them who were highly decorated military leaders, when they become president, they put away the uniform and they put on the suit. So civilian rule over the military, despite the president being a general and the commander-in-chief. He also set the precedent of a yearly address to Congress. This is now formally known as the State of the Union, and it's an address that the president still gives every year. The original ones, of course, were written down rather than delivered orally, but nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the State of the Union exists. It exists because Washington did it. He established the cabinet system, which is also not in the Constitution. The cabinet is a series of advisors that started out, that could have been originally somewhat informal, but was formalized by Washington. Now, of course, cabinet level positions are incredibly important for managing the federal bureaucracy. But under Washington, there were really 3 important positions. Secretary of War Henry Knox, who was the least important. Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, who ran the entire domestic executive branch. And Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, who ran the entire foreign policy apparatus of Washington's administration. It should be noteworthy that Washington picked the ablest men for the job, not paying any attention to political ideology, because there's clearly going to be some serious feuds here between the somewhat centralist federalist Alexander Hamilton and the borderline anti-federalist Thomas Jefferson. He was technically a Federalist in favor of the Constitution, but he and Hamilton are going to not get on particularly well and fight repeatedly throughout all of Washington's first term. Washington also set the 2-term limit by choosing to step down after his second term, despite the fact that he almost certainly would have been unanimously elected a third time. We're not going to talk much about this election either. Again, basically the same election as before, with Washington coming in first and John Adams coming in second. You notice that all the states have ratified the Constitution, but plus we've got a terrifying new state, Kentucky, showing up. But it doesn't really matter. These are the first 2 electoral maps we're looking at, and as you can see, there's not a lot of information you can glean from them. Washington's domestic policy was defined by his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. For more details, I of course encourage you to either read one of the many excellent Hamilton biographies, or of course watch the musical Hamilton on Disney+. Hamilton came up with a 5-part financial system whose goal was to centralize the federal government and make sure that the government could help facilitate financial growth. So, here are the pieces of it that are important. 1, the federal government assumes all federal and state debts. So Hamilton created a national debt and took on the state debts that the states have been laboring under since the Revolution. By agreeing to pay off state debts, Hamilton made sure that the states themselves would be financially solvent and wouldn't spend the next several generations laboring under incredibly oppressive war debts. He also chartered a national bank as a way to standardize currency and originally it was hoped that this bank would create profit for the federal government. And he imposed a high tariff on imported goods as well as a tax on whiskey. This was incredible. Several parts of this became very controversial, but all of this was essential for getting America's financial house in order and making sure the new nation was creditworthy and that it could fulfill its financial obligations. This was most opposed by Thomas Jefferson, who was against almost all parts of this. Actually, was against, let's just say, all parts of this. Jefferson was outraged by the creation of a national bank, arguing that it's not listed in the Constitution, whereas Hamilton, of course, argued that the Elastic Clause clearly provides the ability to do things that are necessary and proper, like charter a national bank. So is chartering a national bank necessary and proper? Well, it depends on your political view, and it depends on your interpretation of the Constitution. Because we start getting these two interpretations of the Constitution. With Hamilton's supporters, the Federalists, supporting something called broad construction, which is the idea that the Constitution should be interpreted loosely, and Jefferson's point of view, which is something called strict construction, which says that you need to interpret the words of the Constitution just as it was written, and you can't do much extra with the Elastic Clause. This was the breakdown of what's called the first party system, the first two political parties in American history, which were created almost immediately into Washington's term. And the Federalists are Hamilton supporters, and the Democratic Republicans, or just Republicans, are Jefferson's supporters. It should be noteworthy that the Federalists got most of their support from the manufacturing areas and the shipping and trade regions along the coast, so merchants, lawyers, landowners, things like that. And Jefferson got his supporters from the farmers, who were worried about being harmed both by the national bank, which they worried would foreclose on people's farms and benefit the wealthy of New York. They were worried about the whiskey tax because many farmers, of course, used their excess grain to distill into whiskey to make some extra income. And they were concerned about the tariff, which they saw as benefiting northern manufacturers and not southerners who would have to pay more for expensive foreign goods. So these are the first two parties. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about them going forward. So make sure you're familiar with these two positions. In the end, Hamilton and James Madison were able to work out a compromise, partially because of their previous work on the Federalist Papers, in which, in order for Jefferson's supporters to pass Hamilton's economic plan, they decided to move the capital southward from New York, where it had been temporarily operating, or Philadelphia, where it was originally chartered, down to a new city that would be constructed on the Potomac River in between Virginia and Maryland. So by moving the capital southward, Hamilton was able to get his economic plan passed, and so the national bank is chartered, and we've got protective tariffs, debt, and a whiskey tax. This whiskey tax kicked off one of the crises near the end of Washington's presidency, the Whiskey Rebellion, in which farmers in western Pennsylvania, who were angry about the whiskey tax, rose up in revolt, armed themselves, began tarring and feathering tax collectors, and generally just making a nuisance of themselves. So this is similar in many ways to the unrest in western Massachusetts in Shays' Rebellion, but now we have a chief executive whose job it is to enforce the laws. And so whereas the Articles government didn't have anyone to make these decisions and had to ask the states for help, Washington very quickly raised an army and set to marching out to western Pennsylvania. This makes Washington the only American president to lead troops in the field while he's president. And so as the troops marched out to western Pennsylvania, the farmers out there heard that the legendary George Washington was coming out to suppress the rebellion, and they decided to quietly go back to their homes and pay their taxes. And so with that, the Whiskey Rebellion was suppressed before it even really picked up steam. The other issue Washington had to deal with was those pesky Native Americans who were still trying to exert their historical claims on the Ohio River Valley and refusing to recognize the fact that first the British got the land from the French, and then we got the land from the British. For some reason, these Native Americans were now arguing that they still owned the land, and the United States didn't actually have any territorial claims to it. The American Revolution did not resolve any of these issues, with Native Americans tending, although not exclusively, to side with the British in the Revolution. And so when the British started to evacuate, they were somewhat concerned that they might be losing one of their key allies. And so one of Washington's goals over the course of his terms was to pacify the Ohio River Valley, more or less the same thing he'd attempted to do back in 1754. So things certainly come all the way around. These land purchases in the West had been stirring up increasing trouble. Although Kentucky had already been settled, places like Pennsylvania and specifically the new territory of Ohio had been settled slowly and were encroaching in areas where more established and powerful tribes were located. And so the story, as of course we always understand it, settlers encroach on native land, there's some hostile confrontation, someone is killed, then there's some massacring, then there's some more massacring, and then eventually an army has to be raised in order to try to fight the Native Americans. So Washington raised that army to go fight the Native Americans, putting in charge Josiah Harmer, who you don't need to know. But you do need to know that he was crushed, the U.S. Army was destroyed, and the Native Americans, under the Miami chief Little Turtle, absolutely obliterated this incredibly poorly trained and unprepared army. So in 1890, Little Turtle crushed this American expeditionary force, and then in 1791, Washington sent another force under St. Clair, which was also crushed by Little Turtle and this time also Blue Jacket. This was one of the worst defeats. This was the worst defeat of the U.S. Army by Native Americans in American history, with the entire force being obliterated and all of their supplies also falling into the hands of the increasingly powerful coalition of Iroquois peoples led by Little Turtle. So what happened is Washington empowered Anthony Wayne, who was a former Revolutionary War general, to build an even larger and hopefully better trained army to go fight the Native Americans. And so he did so and spent more than a year prepping and drilling his army, specifically teaching them how to fight in the forests of the Ohio River Valley and studying Native American battle tactics. And so all this preparation paid off, and Anthony Wayne led his coalition, his army, to defeat the Native American coalition at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where the Native Americans were firmly defeated, and the Treaty of Fort Greenville was signed, where Little Turtle and Blue Jacket agreed to cede the southern parts of what is today Ohio to the Americans, with the understanding that the northern parts of Ohio would stay in Native American hands forever. So, with the problem of Native Americans on the frontier permanently solved, Washington's administration could rest assured that Americans could settle this part of the Ohio River Valley, and we'd never again have to worry about conflict with Native Americans on the frontier. Of course, in the South, there was still trade, especially with several Native American groups, and so economic activity with Native Americans continued. And of course, the Treaty of Greenville line would hold only for a couple years until we would repeatedly break the treaty, leading to another round of violence and bloodshed. The other issue that Washington had to deal with is the French Revolution was starting to break out at this time. And I'm going to do a quick supplemental leading you through the French Revolution in between this recording and the next one. But it's important to understand that the French Revolution eventually led to France going to war with basically everyone else in Europe right around 1791. And so this is going to create a problem, of course, because we trade with France and we trade with England. And when they're at war with each other, both of them start attacking our shipping. And so where the United States stands vis-a-vis the French Revolutionary Wars is complicated and problematic, because we have economic ties with both, and we've also signed a treaty of permanent alliance with France. But, as they pointed out in Cabinet Battle Number 2 in Hamilton, that treaty was with the King of France, who was executed right around 1791. And so do we have a treaty with the new French revolutionary government? Who really knows? The French, of course, were eager to try to get us on their side, but when they dispatched a representative to try to discuss this, he ended up being a total disaster in that he antagonized Washington specifically. He kept trying to recruit Americans to arm their ships and go attack the British. And he started setting up a series of Jacobin clubs within the United States, which, if you don't know anything about the French Revolution, that should raise some concerns for you that these Jacobin clubs are starting to pop up all over the place. So Citizen Genet tried to rile up the Americans against George Washington, and he utterly failed. And then the French Revolution turned and he was recalled. The French tried to recall him to have him executed, and Washington granted him asylum. It's honestly an interesting little chapter in American history. You should just look it up. What's important is it led to increasing tension between the United States and France, and it led to Washington passing a statement of neutrality, a formal declaration that the United States was going to stay out of these wars. Unfortunately, this appeased neither side, and both sides kept attacking our shipping, but that's going to be a problem for another president to solve. Washington, in order to try to solve some of these issues, did sign the infamous Jay's Treaty with England, which somewhat normalized our relationships with England, but didn't get to the issue of impressment, which was at the heart of the treaty. The British were supposed to remove the forts they still had on our soil, and were supposed to pay debts to us, and then we were going to pay our debts to them, but none of this stuff actually happened, and all it really ended up doing is really antagonizing the French and then the Jeffersonians, who tended to be more pro-French. And so the signing and negotiation of Jay's Treaty is what led Jefferson to and so the signing and the finalization of Jay's Treaty is what led Jefferson to finally resign from the Washington's cabinet and kicked off the formal battle between the Federalists and the Republicans. Piccaninny's Treaty was also signed during Washington's presidency, which formalized the idea that Spain controlled Florida and the border, although this is going to become a problem later, and dealt with some of our latent border issues with the Spanish, who still controlled the Louisiana Territory at this point. So, with Jefferson now resigning from Washington's cabinet, we get the formal creation of the Republican Party, which assured us that the age of uncontested elections would be over. So the Federalist Party is mostly embodied and led by Alexander Hamilton, whereas the Republican Party becomes embodied by Jefferson and then James Madison. So we're going to get a contested elections going here on out. Washington also had to deal with the issue of Barbary pirates, who, as we talked about last time, were still attacking our ships. We had these Barbary pirates would then take Americans hostage and hold them for ransom. And again, we mentioned the British were very rudely no longer protecting our ships along the Mediterranean Sea. We had created a coast guard to help defend our coasts, but of course, this did very little to help merchant ships that were all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. And so Washington passed the Naval Act, formally creating our standing navy. So 1794, we get the Naval Act, creating our first 6 frigates, with the idea that with a blue water navy, we'd actually be able to exert power and perhaps intimidate these pirates and defend our ships across the ocean. But again, that's more a story for another day. So that's Washington's presidency. I maybe went through it too quickly, but hopefully you were able to get the key pieces here. And as Washington leaves office, he gives his famous farewell address, which you read some excerpts of. He chooses not to run for re-election, and he argues against political parties, foreign alliances, and sectionalism. Obviously, the political parties thing is just straight out. We're already having those. Even as he gave his farewell address, political parties are going to happen. And sectionalism, also clearly a thing. So the only piece of this that really was lasting is Washington's warning against foreign alliances. So we do not sign a formal alliance with any European countries until after World War II, partially because of Washington's insistence that we need to stay apart. So hopefully you read excerpts of that, and hopefully you can also accomplish these tasks with some level of detail. So that brings us to the end of Washington's presidency. Next time we'll be back to see how the second president, John Adams, can follow through on Washington's legacy.